Hi friends, I just wanted to take a quick minute and give you a couple of updates on things in regard to church services. Wednesdays and Sunday morning, Sunday night will be on our church YouTube site. Wednesday nights and Wednesday afternoon services are all online. There's nothing on the church property. Sunday morning and Sunday night, as far as things go right now, we had a great time on the property with the drive-in church. We're going to do it again this week as the Lord allows. I wanted to mention a couple things perhaps to help you, and I feel like we're a little separated and removed from you and from each other. It was so great just seeing everybody in the property, but if you have a need, please call us. I've said that over and over. Any staff member would be happy to do whatever we are capable of. We can come by your house if you need something, pick something up, whatever. We had somebody stop by the church, just happened to be when a staff member was there. They just wanted to drop off their offering, and that's never a problem. But timing, we have staff on and off the property all through the day. So to help you, we're going to have a staff member on the property every day from 2 to 3 o'clock. And so that might make it a little easier for you. You can come by anytime during the day, and there's a box of tracts and offering envelopes and whatever other helpful information we can give. We'll have in a box at the office front door and the Sunday school building front door, and you can come grab a tract or whatever you need. But if you want to drop something off or you need to see one of us between 2 and 3 every day of the week, I want to make sure one of our staff members just come by the office. Well, they're likely to be hanging around out in the parking lot looking for you. But during that hour, we just felt like we didn't want you to wonder how to get a hold of us. And I know some people in our church are so gracious. I don't want to bother you. Well, you're not a bother. Please call. But if it would help, if you need to stop by the church physically for any reason, from 2 to 3, one of us will be there. And again, please let us be of service to you. We love you. Thank God for you. And we sure look forward to seeing you again on the property at the drive-in church on Sunday, but online at each of the services. Good evening. These evenings for the past week or so have been some things about some great people God's used in getting American freedom established. I spent last night talking about our church and a little bit about how our church got here, and would love to be able to tell the stories of people that God used. God brought people like Esther for such a time as this. God brought people into our community and into our lives totally without our effort. It wasn't our wisdom. It wasn't our exercising of soul winning and great preaching. God just put pieces together. And could I assure you before we get started tonight, God has a plan. And the great work of God, the plan of God, the redemption of mankind, the most incredible, miraculous thing in the history of the world, that a sinful man headed to hell could become a child of God on his way to heaven. That great work of redemption, that's the heartbeat of God. That's what he sent his son to do. God sent his son into the world to save sinners. And Christ gave his life to save sinners. And may we never forget that the circumstances of life and the things that God does them with a purpose. And we know Romans 8:28, and we get so familiar we can almost be too casual about it, that there is a God in heaven, and he does, all things work together for good, and we get flippant, but it really does. It really does. And God truly does have a plan, a great plan, a plan to accomplish and to achieve and to build and to conform us to the image of Christ, that we might glorify him, but also to use us to influence the world around us. And with all that being said, tonight I want to talk about another man that's greatly influenced our history, especially our Baptist history. And we'll talk about some people. And when we were doing the history of Baptists in America, I mentioned the steps of freedom, getting freedom into America, and then following on, I mentioned Dr. Jim Beller's book. Brother Beller is an incredible man, and his book, America in Crimson, read everybody. It's not a kid's book. It's some pretty serious reading. But what a great book for an American to read, to see how did we get where we are. And God puts these things in places. But in the path of God accomplishing things, I'm going to feature some books in these evenings. And I want to just show you this. This is a hardbound book, Ropes to Burma. And this is, boy, if you can see it, you can see it from here. I love these books. It's got big print. It's got some pictures, not many, but there's a few of them in there. And this book is about Luther Rice. Now, most of us know, and I will probably in the next, maybe tomorrow, maybe the next day, I'll talk a little bit about this book, and Adoniram Judson, To the Golden Shore. This is not a kid's book. This is a serious book to read, and you can't go through more than a page or two without putting it down to pray and to examine your own heart. We're not going to talk about Adoniram Judson. I'm going to talk about the story of Luther Rice. And when we begin talking about the great work that God is doing through us and in our lives, and sometimes we don't understand why God does certain things. Luther Rice was born the typical young man in the era of farming and a day of just rural life, farms and sharing your labor and other people's labors. You're cutting the hay, and in the late 1700s, Luther Rice was born. And I mention this book because young men ought to read this especially. It talks about hard work, character, honesty, integrity. Young ladies, it would be good for them as well, as we think about Ann Judson, the first lady missionary from America. But Luther Rice was brought up in a typical small farming area and working a farm. And as he grew, by the time he hit 13, he was doing a man's work. And a long story, he began in his late teens to struggle. He was in the Congregational church, sprinkled as an infant, and they went to church on Sunday. But he says, when we left church, we also left God and religion. The week ahead, Monday through Friday and Saturday, was busy for work and business and family, and Sunday was God's day, but that was the only day that was God's day. Well, Luther Rice began to bother him, and these things of his soul and the things of eternity. And his father told him, work harder, keep busy, and don't worry about your soul or eternity. Well, Luther Rice did. And at 19, he made a decision to trust Christ and get that settled in his life, still in the Congregational church. And Luther Rice, I'm going to hurry through some things, but in the days that followed, Luther Rice went to college. He ended up in a what we would call a Bible college, and he met several other young men, and this group of men were so touched by the importance of God and seeking God's will. They began in college days to have time in prayer. They'd slip off when things weren't busy, and they'd go out into a field somewhere, and they'd spend great length of time in prayer. This group of 6 young men, and just college guys, praying, seeking God's direction, begging for God's will for their lives, longing to serve God. And over a course of events here and there, different things happened. They began to get exposed to the idea of foreign missions. At the time, in the 1700s, Baptists and even the Congregationalists, but especially the Baptists, but the churches in America were primarily interested in the Indians in America. And they were just trying to get churches established. A few of the Congregational and a few of the Protestant churches were having a little bit of missions work done around the world, but not much. And Baptists almost none at all. Now, Luther Rice was still a Congregationalist at this time, but more and more their hearts were burdened. They began to be burdened for specific countries, but there was no organization. This new fledgling country, there was no organization that would gather missions money and help support missions, and how do you get to the mission field and all those details. And these men began praying and seeking God's help. And over the time they were in college, from until they graduated, they began to pray and to seek God's face. A missions, much through their efforts, a missions organization was formed, and missions money was gathered among the churches. And these men, 4 of the 6 men, were actually commissioned, and at their graduation they were ordained, and they were to be sent off to the mission field. And Adoniram Judson was one of those men. Of course, became very famous. But Luther Rice was another one of those men. But Luther Rice, through a series of events, 2 men's names got scratched off the list of 6 to present to the people to send them overseas. And Luther Rice was heartbroken, but he continued to finish up his school and his training and working with the guys. They had their prayer meetings. They were a special group of young men. And as it got near to going, his heart broke for India. And he'd heard of William Carey and the great work William Carey was doing in India. And William Carey's son Felix was in Burma, where Adoniram Judson would eventually go. And he'd heard of all the work that God was doing. His heart broke, and he wanted so much to go, but his name had been scratched for whatever reason. And he found out, though, that if he could raise his own money, they would send him. But they felt like the missions organization could only handle emotionally, mentally, or whatever it was, the 4 rather than the 6. And so he went church to church, and Luther Rice raised his own money, raised enough money to get to India. He's getting ready to go. It's getting near ordination. It's getting near graduation time. He had this lovely young girl he was going to marry. Adoniram Judson had already married Anne. They were on their way. Well, he was about to marry Anne. And they were on their way to India, and there were several married couples going, and Luther Rice had been speaking to his girlfriend. And one of the things that I find when we start talking about serving God is God has sometimes a price to pay, and sometimes it's working on our heart, sometimes working on the circumstances around us, and we don't know what God's doing. In our current situation here in America, we don't know what God's trying to accomplish. Is there some great preacher that God is stirring his heart, and he's just a boy or a girl? Is there a college young person that God is using these unusual days, not as much social contact, to draw that young man into prayer? We have no idea what God's doing, but we know this: he does all things well. We can trust him. You have a great and a mighty God, and we just need to be faithful to live for God, honor God, trust God, be in our Bibles and walk with God, and seek God's face. And as we grow older, we it might be that we need to understand our role is more to seek God and to pray and to intercede to God on behalf of others who are doing great things. But there's no lack of scripture talking about older people who served and ministered to God, and God pointed these people out in scripture. These are very significant people. Well, Luther Rice, he's talking to this young lady that he's engaged to. I mean, his heart was so passionate for India, and he was so stirred, and he's talking to her with such passion and excitement. And she says to him, "Luther, you're the best preacher among all the young men." Her dad was a man of great influence. She said, "My dad could recommend you, and the president of the college could recommend you, and all these people. You could have any church in the area, and we could serve Christ the rest of our lives right here." And Luther Rice, as he listened to her talk, he realized she did not have a burden like he'd had. Luther realized that this young lady didn't have a heart for the work of God like he had a heart for these lost. And he said, "Can you not imagine, can you not see in your heart these people lost in sin and hopeless? They don't know the gospel." She said, "I can imagine a people who don't want us there. Do they even want our God? Where would we live? How would we even communicate?" And she was definitely not the wife for Luther Rice to have. And his heart broke. But he and Adoniram and this group of men and several wives, they traveled 2 separate ships. One went around one direction under South America. One went the other direction under Africa, off the east coast of the United States, and found their ways several weeks apart in their arrival time in Calcutta. On the way there, Luther Rice and Adoniram Judson as well had done some serious studying, and the subject, they knew they were meeting William Carey, the famous Baptist, and William Carey, or Adoniram Judson, had read several books on the subject, and he'd studied. He went through his New Testament every time it talked about baptism and studied it and searched the scriptures, and he challenged Luther Rice and his wife as well, Ann Judson, said, you could basically, you can become a Baptist, but don't expect me to become a Baptist. But he challenged her, you read through you study every text in the New Testament where it talks about baptism, and you just ask God if he wouldn't lead you. Well, it wasn't long before Ann decided she needed to be a Baptist. Luther Rice decided, and these three congregational missionaries became Baptists, and they were baptized there in India. And you'd think, wow, this is great. They're now saved. They've been they were saved. They've surrendered. They've raised the money to go. They get to India, and there in Calcutta, they've met the great missionary from England, William Carey, the father of modern missions. And he had an amazing ministry, a printing ministry, and unbelievable works he'd done. And we may talk some about William Carey, but he translated the Bible into multiple languages. I mean, a phenomenal man, brilliant man. Now that God's going to use them in this great work, because we all have dreams of being used. And the first thing that happened is war between the United States and Great Britain breaks out. And with that war, India under British control, Britain didn't trust these Americans. They felt like they were spies, and they told them they had to leave the country. Not only did they have to leave the country, they were going to have to leave on a special ship by the group of British merchants who ran things there in India, and they were sure they were going to be carried back to England to be thrown in prison as spies. And so they snuck off out of the city and down the river on one ship, and then they were caught, and they got into another ship, and then they finally get away, and they're over to an island. Well, in the process, all this time, Luther Rice has lost so much weight. He's been sick. He's been burdened for what's going on, even getting to India. He was not eating, he was not drinking, he'd lost so much weight, and then leaving. His heart broke. His heart broke in loneliness for the girl he loved. His heart broke in loneliness when he had to leave India. That was his heart's desire. And now traveling from this island to a ship to that island, and he's separated from Adoniram and Ann Judson and his other friends, because the decision was made. Luther Rice, remember there was 4 missionaries that were approved by the Congregational Mission Board. Luther Rice was not one of them. He went and gathered his own money, and he got to know a lot of preachers. And the decision was made, if we're going to be Baptists, we're going to have to go back and get Baptist money. We're going to have to resign from the Congregationalist Mission Board. And this is all character and integrity. These men were not about to stay in India preaching a Baptist faith and a Baptist baptism while they're being supported by congregational money. And so they wanted to do things right. And oh, how the people of God ought to long to do things right. Luther Rice goes back to America. It took him over a year to get back to America. And at one point he's on a ship, and that ship was going to take him right into New York. But the war was going on. And the man said, "You can't." The captain said, "You can't ride on with us." He'd been there and on one ship, then another. He was well known in the area, and the men from one ship to another knew him, and he'd been witnessing, and he'd been preaching. And the captain said, "You can't travel with me." And he said, "Why not? I'll pay my way." He said, "It's not about money." He said, "If we get stopped by a British ship, we're going to have to lie about our cargo, because we're smuggling in cargo for the war effort." And he said, "It's very likely they will make every man on my ship swear we don't have any contraband." And he said, "You strike me as a man who won't swear that way." And Luther Rice said, "You're right, I'm a man who won't swear." And that's the testimony of this young man, still in his 20s. There's no way. They knew he wouldn't lie. He wouldn't swear to something that wasn't true. He was a man, I'm sure in that day, they wouldn't take an oath of any kind. And so he has to take another ship. That ship had no preacher. They had no, the men on the ship said, "We haven't had a parson here. We haven't had any reverend here on any of our travels. We'd love to have it if you would be willing to sing and preach to us." And of course, he was in his glory and all the way back to America. Now he gets to America. And why is he there? To resign from the Congregational Mission Board, to affiliate himself with the Baptist Church, and then to seek God's will. Understand this, everything in his life for the last 6 years had been built on going to India, and God took him out of India. He got there long enough to see what it was like, to be around it for a little while, but he wasn't there very long before he was back. His dearest friends in the world were now in Burma, just a little side country next to India. And he's back in America. His dreams were broken. He'd lost his fiance to go to India, and now he's not in India, he's back in America. God does things, and God has a plan, and God has a purpose. And Luther Rice teaches us faith, teaches us to trust, teaches us one step at a time, obey God and follow his will. Luther Rice comes back to America, and he finds some Baptists and realizes the Baptists, remember, they were illegal in America. We finished that, if you followed my series, up into the late 1600s. You couldn't be a Baptist in America. And Roger Williams and John Smith got that first free place in Rhode Island where you could be a Baptist and have a Baptist church. And the Baptist churches were slowly growing, still under some persecution. A lot of Baptist preachers in Virginia in jail. And there we come along, and during that time we end up with the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, all because of Baptist persecution. Had there not been the persecution of the Baptists, there would not have been the passion for freedom that John Adams and Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin had. These men's passion for freedom of conscience, much of it was born in watching these Baptists suffer. Why were there more Baptists jailed in Virginia than anywhere else in the colonies? Perhaps because that's where every one of our founders lived or frequented, and they saw these things. Well, the same with Luther Rice. Luther Rice comes back and thinks, here I am trying to do the will of God. And what a mess this is. And he starts visiting Baptist church to Baptist church and starts working his way into the South and telling the stories. Well, there were Baptists who had literally had a organization. It was an anti-foreign missions organization. We are in America to take the gospel to the West, and we're not going to send our money around the world. Some of them even followed him. Could you imagine trying to stir people? See, in Acts chapter 1, when he says, ye shall be witnesses of me unto me in Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria and unto the uttermost parts of the earth, that was supposed to start in Acts chapter 1 when he sent them out into the world. And yet Baptists had been tortured and imprisoned and outlawed and banished and chased from city to city. And the gospel, the writings of the Baptists were burned, and the churches were very small or non-existent. And even the gospel preaching Protestants, they were more concerned with their development and their movement west and what was going on. And so very, very difficult days. And yet God had a plan in all this. And so now we've got these very disjoint, unaffiliated Baptists. There were a few Baptist associations, but very small, and they were little tiny country churches scattered all over. Remember, we talked a little bit about Shubal Stearns, and out of his church, there were 1,000 Baptist churches born in the next 2 generations, and probably our entire Bible Belt owes its existence to Shubal Stearns, a man who was just willing to preach the gospel and go soul winning and start churches. Well, Luther Rice, he started out after, and I mentioned this book. This is a book you can pick up online. It's out of print right now, but you can find them online, and it's probably $6 or $7. A great book to get your kids, especially when they're sitting home driving you crazy. A good book to read to this would be a great reading book for you to read to your children, you parents. So Luther Rice begins traveling and raising money and sending it to the Judsons. And then through these pastors, he forms a Baptist Foreign Missions Association. He travels more, and all this time he never married. And he traveled, he lived on a wagon, he lived with almost nothing. He had one suit of clothes he guarded very carefully for when he came to a meeting. And he spent his life, he was invited, after years of preaching and traveling and preaching and traveling, he was invited to be the president of a Bible college, training young men, many of whom he hoped would go to the mission field. But going to God, he found no peace, and he continued to travel as an itinerant preacher. And his goal was to find men who were consecrated, who would give their hearts to foreign missions, and point those men to a Baptist organization, a group of Baptist churches that would support the man and his family and get him overseas. And his entire work was stirring America for foreign missions. And he spent his entire life doing that. And as a very young man in his 50s, Luther Rice finally passed away, lived his life, absolutely surrendered to the will of God, a man of prayer. You read his story and you read about great times of prayer, faithfully fasting. The one day, maybe it was the first and third Mondays of the month or whatever, he had his set days set aside for fasting and for prayer and memorize scriptures, memorize the Word of God and preach the Word of God. His heart, every time he'd get letters from Ann and Adoniram Judson, his heart broke for foreign missions and where he longed to be. And yet God kept him and never gave him liberty to go back overseas. These dear friends he never saw again, but he spent his life gathering them. That's why the book is called Ropes to Burma. He was to hold the ropes, the financial ropes. And Burma is where Ann and Adoniram ended up, and the great work of the Judsons went on. And so here we've got a man who gave up his home and his family, gave up his home religion. He gave up his country. He wanted so much to go to India. He gave up his home country. Then he gave up the country he loved that he wanted to go to come back to America. He gave up his fiance, and then he gave his life, traveled and preached, never had a home. He had a family home where his parents and his siblings were, but he never stayed there more than a very, very short time. He traveled Baptist church to Baptist church, stirring the hearts of people for the world and stirring their prayer life and how much we ought to pray for the foreign field. Burma still, India still, Southeast Asia still, 1 billion people in India needing the gospel, and we couldn't send enough preachers to reach India like it ought to be reached. But how we ought to pray for those preachers that are there, for the native Indian preachers, and how we ought to think about a life dedicated to holiness, integrity, character, hard work. One of the roots of our church's philosophies in America comes back to an unknown man, Luther Rice, who gave his heart to support foreign missions. And I challenge you, if he was willing to give his entire life with no home to die in, no marriage, no children to pass on his spiritual or his earthly legacy to, if he gave all that for foreign missions, couldn't we have a missions envelope every week that we put something in? And couldn't we support these great missionaries that go around the world? I hope you'll consider Luther Rice, and we'll talk some more about some other great men in the days ahead. And I want to encourage you, get some good reading. This is a good start to a children's library or to an adult's library. I've had this book a long time. I love kids' books. They're easier to read. Have a great night. God bless you. Pray for your country. Pray for your church. And pray for churches across America for God's rich blessing.